Here were the questions. How does Karl Marx define capitalists and proletarians? Those are the two, as it were, heroes, but I mean, not literally heroes, but the two major players in the system that he called, or that we call capitalism. Turns out he didn't actually use that word, okay? Came along later, historically, but that's okay. We can use it now. He meant it in that sense. They were categories of people that have a place within what he calls a mode of production. A mode of production basically means an economic system. Karl Marx believed that history was a progression of one kind of mode of production after another. He believed that the very first mode of production was more or less what we call a hunter-gatherer society. Simple technologies, people not growing anything, very small groups, and basically what we may have learned or you already know about hunter and gatherers, that's what he thought the first mode of production was. And then he thought there were ones that replaced that mode of production, and he's absolutely correct. Okay, that view is kind of held up by what we know archaeologically. Eventually, you have more complex forms of modes of production with more people, larger scales, more advanced forms of technology, greater productivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have something called feudalism. Okay, so in Europe, throughout the so-called Western world, the dominant mode of production, according to Marx, was this thing called feudalism, which we'll talk about in just a second. And that ended up being replaced or succeeded by capitalism. In Marx's view, modes of production don't last forever. Just like every other system that are part of history, they have a beginning, they pass through time and change, and eventually they fade away to be replaced by other modes of production. So from a Marxist point of view, a Marxian point of view, okay, we shouldn't be surprised to consider the idea that what we call capitalism may not be around forever, okay? So who are these capitalists? Okay, capitalists, well, actually, let me do this. Let me actually go to infrastructure. Let me remember the words that I want to talk about that I asked you guys. In superstructure, what is the importance of conflict? Okay, before I go to so we just got done talking about Emile Durkheim. If you remember Emile Durkheim, division of labor, collective consciousness, all that stuff, Emile Durkheim's question was, what's the glue that holds society together? How do all the parts fit together? How do things stay the same? How does a system conserve itself over time? And he's really interested too in the way people are brought into a harmonious relationship with one another, okay? That they complement each other, that they complete each other, that they fit and they work, okay? So how things fit together, how social relations are harmonious, and how things stay the same. Karl Marx famously, as you may have read in your textbook, said that the engine that drives change, that drives history, is precisely conflict. And he talked in particular about class conflict. But he meant conflict between categories of people, groups of people in the broadest sense, but mostly in terms of their role in the economy, in the system of producing stuff that people use, eat, sleep in, travel with, and so on, right? Transportation, housing, et cetera, all that stuff. That mode of production is essentially an economic system. That's his term for it, okay? Okay, then we're class consciousness, false consciousness. Okay, once again, conflict for Marx is at the center of his view of the social world. He thinks it's the most important or relevant feature of it to look at if you want to explain how the world became the way it is, how things will change, and so on. Okay, so let me erase that. And let me go and show you this story. I'm going to tell you a little story if you guys like stories. And the story that Marx tells comes from one of his, well, his most famous book of all time. Anybody know the name of his, anybody familiar with Marx by any chance? I'm just going to stop it. I'm going to unshare for a second and look at who I've got here. Jonathan, you, anybody ever heard of Karl Marx before? I asked that only from the reading, really. Okay, well, that's interesting. It's interesting for me because his name used to be much more of a household word, I guess, growing up. And, you know, that's to be expected. Things change over time, stuff that's part of the general culture. My expectation is kind of that people wouldn't have heard of Emil Durkheim, but may have run across Karl Marx's name before. He wrote a book, The Father of Communism. You know what? I guess it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that. It would be a bit of a simplification, but it points in the right direction. Absolutely, it points in the right direction. Look, this is a whole other discussion. We could have an entire semester just dedicated to things like, you know, the history of economic political movements in the Western world, in Europe, in the United States, and they would involve all kinds of groups that call themselves socialist, communist, anarchist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, he did in fact call himself a communist at times, and his organizations. He sometimes called himself a socialist. And what the difference was between socialism and communism, basically it was just kind of word games they were playing around. Like, you know, if somebody you're having a disagreement with who's on the same team calls himself a socialist, well, you might say, well, then I'm not a socialist, I'm something else, and I give myself a different name. You know, that kind of stuff, in-group fighting. So sometimes there are labels without, different labels without a huge difference in meaning. And sometimes we're not gonna worry about what is the correct definition of something like communism or something like socialism. What we're gonna look at is Karl Marx's analysis of modes of production, economic systems that he says change over time through conflict, a process of conflict. And we're going to tell the story that he told, I think, brilliantly about how feudalism became capitalism. Okay, so I'm going to take you to this screen up here. And here we go. Okay, so can you see that okay? Let's see, I don't know if I can make it any bigger. So hopefully, I want to use this because it's got all the relevant information that I want to talk about. So Marx is going to tell the story, and this will allow us to talk about the main concepts that you run across and that I want you to know. Okay, Western Europe, Great Britain, France, you name it, over in Europe, back up until the early 1500s, Europe had what we'll call a feudal economy. Okay, a feudal economy. What's a feudal economy? This may be review for some people that heard this before in a history class. It was mostly a countryside. It was mostly farming, right? What you have is you have somebody who owns a big plot of land that's good for farming. And you're going to grow stuff. You're going to grow grains and corns and potatoes and whatever it is that you grow that you can use for subsistence. People can live on, right? And what you have is you have an owner of the land, the Lord. Okay? So in a feudal mode of economy, the most important categories of person in the economy were the Lord or the nobility, right? The person who had the title, he owned the land. And then the person who lived on the land, the peasant. So here's the Lord. How did the Lord become the Lord? Probably he ended up being granted the land by some other powerful guy, right? There was some alliance, they went to war together, and then this really powerful landowner said, hey, for doing that, here you go. I'm going to give you this plot of land, and then all your children and their children's children, the deed or title to that land will be passed down to you, right? So he's a rich guy. He owns all this land. And then all the little people, the commoners, right, the peasantry, they live on the land. What does the Lord do? The Lord does all the cool stuff, right? The Lord gets to walk around in all kinds of cool clothes, and he gets to wear a sword, and his knights get to follow him around, and he gets to, negotiate with other powerful people, and he gets to sell land and, all the good stuff. What does the peasant get to do? He gets to work his butt off, right? In the fields, growing stuff. So the peasant's working, and here's how this works, okay? So the peasant works for, say, 7 days a week, 6 days a week. Let's say that 2/3 of the time that he works, the stuff that he makes is used for him to consume, right? Enough for him and his family. But he keeps working even longer. And the deal is that the other third of what you produce, this extra stuff, okay, excess or surplus, call that surplus, right? That's excess above what you normally make or what you need or what your family requires to eat. That surplus goes to the Lord, right? So you work hard, you work for yourself, you feed your family, but then you keep on working, and that extra surplus goes to the Lord. And Marx said that's a form of exploitation. Okay, he called that exploitation. Okay, surplus extraction from the peasant was exploitation because the peasants were in a spot, right? They were weak, they were poor, they didn't really have a choice. So the Lord, basically, he's in a position to take advantage of their kind of weakness or vulnerability. Look, if you don't want to work for me, what can you do? Practically nothing, right? I mean, migrate somewhere else and they'll end up working for some other Lord, okay? Now, so there's that situation. One thing that we want to point out is this. The peasants in feudalism had what was called the commons. What was the commons? The commons was like this open territory where you could go and fish, you could go and hunt, you could, if you had some livestock, some sheep or goats or what have you, you could pasture them. You could use the commons to gather firewood. You could use the commons. So here was a typical kind of setup. If you're a peasant living here, here's what you do. You work your butt off, right? You feed your family, but you also work for the Lord. By the way, you may end up doing other things for him, like repairing bridges, constructing an extra addition to his castle or what have you, right? That's kind of the deal. How do you become a peasant? You're born into peasantry. Your father and mother worked on the land before you, and then kind of the arrangement was that if you live on the Lord's land, your children get to live there too, right? So it's kind of a guarantee. In a way, you're kind of forced into that situation, but it's also a kind of guarantee that you'll have this place to live and work and so on. Okay, anyway, so you have the commons. Okay, so this is a pretty common arrangement. It's what Marx called, it's a feudal mode of production or economy. It has two major players, and one of the things you want to look at is this, okay, a systematic feature of this system was that the peasant works for a kind of wage. Right? What does he get? He gets to keep enough of what he produces to feed himself and his family, to survive. And he gets to use the commons. But he also has to keep working. And even though he's the one who does the work and makes the stuff, this extra stuff goes to the Lord. Okay? Now, here's what Marx, I asked you guys to, in your textbook, look up false consciousness. Okay, and what you probably read is that, well, false consciousness, let me give a definition. It's kind of a distorted view of the world. It's a distorted view of the world, but it's a very particular distortion. It's a kind of distortion that allows exploitation to go on because it's not seen as something unjust. It's seen as natural, as reasonable, as something that you deserve as much as have to suffer. Okay? So false consciousness is the product, and I'm going to use this word here, and I want you guys to remember it, ideology. Ideology. I can't remember if that's in your textbook or not, but ideology is and it's in your PowerPoint as well. Okay, it's in the Marx PowerPoint. Ideology is a system of beliefs, and when Marx uses the term, it's a system of beliefs that serves to justify what's unjust or to render reasonable seeming, okay, what is exploitative. It makes exploitation seem okay. Let me give you the example. So in the feudal economy, here's a question. Here's a question for you guys. So the peasants, as you probably imagine, they outnumbered the lords by lots, right? Probably like 95 to 99% of the people in this older agricultural system, they're not the nobility, they're the commoners. The vast majority of people are these simple peasants. And they're getting a raw deal, right? They're exploited. Why do they put up with it? I mean, they could beat the lords in a drop of a hat if they got their act together, right? I mean, even if your first response is to say, well, the Lord's got all the weapons, right? He's got all the cool stuff. He's got the armor, he's got the knights, etc. I'm going to still say that, when you're outnumbered like 95% to 5% or whatever, I don't know. It would seem that overall force is still in the favor of the peasants. So one answer to the question of why the peasants didn't get up in arms as often as they might have. Occasionally they did, but not very often. And one question is why, and you could say because of ideology. A set of ideas or beliefs, a system of ideas, beliefs, ways of looking at the world, beliefs. Let me even put down, what's another word? Worldview, a kind of total set of beliefs that shape how the world looks to you. And according to that view, well, did I write it down here? Belief in superiority of the Lord and divine rule. So from cradle to grave, you were exposed in church and out of church, at the hands, at the foot of your mother and father and so on. Everyone around you exposed you to the belief that if you were born a peasant, that meant you were low born. You were literally low born. Okay, so the Lord is born high. And they actually had beliefs about blood. They thought, if you're highborn, you have superior blood. And this blood, flows down through the generations, right? You inherit the blood of the superior people, and so you're superior yourself. Okay? The peasant is low-born. He's a commoner. He doesn't have that good stuff in his blood. And that's why aristocracy, the nobility, kept really close track of family genealogies. And they want to make sure down which kind of branches the good blood flowed. Lord high, peasant low. So these are beliefs. look, from our point of view, from today's world, 2020, right? We look back and we see like the Lord owns the land and he says, well, that's because I'm made of finer stuff. I was born high, you were born low. And we say, oh, that's a bunch of bunk, right? I mean, that's in all likelihood, that's just, it's what you were taught, right? It's what you grew up being exposed to. It doesn't reflect anything in your biological nature. Okay? But the idea is that these ideas are powerful. Ideas are powerful and they set limits on what we believe is possible, what we believe is right, what we believe we can and should do. So if you're a peasant, you grow up just saying, hey, this is where I was put. This is my place. This is where I'm supposed to be. And if I try to rise up out of my station, take arms up against the Lord, I mean, that's a gross violation of, the divine order of things. Okay? I don't know how clear all this is. I'm doing all the talking here and, not getting feedback. If anybody does have questions, you got that chat thing and you can always hit me up with I'm not following that at all, or please help me out with this little thing or that little thing, and I'll try to respond to it. Okay, so that was the feudal mode of production, and I'm going to tell this very, very quickly. Try to tell it as quickly as I can. So Marx is going to tell a story about how feudalism changed over time, and through a process that was full of conflicts, it gave rise to a capitalist mode of production or economy. It did this in England, what's seen as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. You may be familiar with that, like mid-1700s to the early 1800s. Where you have the use of steam power for one, new kinds of contraptions, new kinds of machines for weaving threads. So you have like the textile mill industry producing clothes and linens and so on, becoming much more productive, okay? Producing much more stuff, and over time, especially through the 1800s, England becomes a monstrously wealthy country compared to other countries because of this new kind of economic system of capitalism. Here's Marx's story about what happens. Okay? One of the things that happens to this feudal economy is some landowners, some of these lords, see an opportunity for making a lot of money if they convert their fields into sheep raising territory, into sheep raising pastures. Why? Because across the sea there's some businesses that are selling like woolen products, mittens and coats and so on, and really doing well, making a killing. So what happens is some of these guys decide to convert. So let me erase this so I can kind of draw the story as it's happening here. To convert this land into sheep raising territories, and in the process, what they got to do is they got to kick the peasants off the land. And guess what? The peasants don't want to leave the land, because what are the peasants going to do? Right? They're going to be in bad shape. And there is a conflict. So there's a big conflict between the landowning class and the working class, right? The peasantry. And eventually, the peasants, over a very long period of time, literally centuries, the peasants lose this battle, okay? The peasants, they dig in their heels at first, but the lords, they use weaponry at first, and then they appeal to Parliament. They get laws passed, and these laws are called, let's see, I can't remember if I asked you to remember this. I don't think so. They're called enclosure acts, but long story short is this territory gets divvied up into like private plots. And they say, if you want to stay there against my wishes, you're now like, trespassing and you're in violation of the law, and we can kick you out, we can evict you, and we can have, that order enforced through power, okay, through military intervention, police force. And this leads to, over time, to a big exodus or migration of country workers into the cities. Happens over the centuries, happens over a very long time. And so and then let me jump to sort of the outcome of all this long process. Whereas in feudalism you had lords and peasants. These peasants, many of them are kicked out. They head to the cities as we move into the 1700s. And in the cities, you start seeing these factories springing up, especially textile mill factories at first, but then other kinds of factories. And a lot of them need workers. And they need workers who will work as cheap as possible. And peasants will work as cheaply as possible because they don't have anything else to offer, right? Being peasants, they don't have any skills that are of, considerable value. So they'll practically work for whatever the going rate happens to be, as little as, and so whereas we have lord and peasants, we now have what Marx calls proletarians. What is a proletarian? A proletarian it's basically a worker, a working class person who worked in the factories. And a proletarian, let's see, from your book, if I remember what your book said, it's basically a working class person. They have no means of production. What does it mean if you're a proletarian? It means that the only thing of value that you possess as you enter the market is your capacity to work. Okay? You don't have other assets. And it's your capacity to work. It's not even the skills and education and competencies that you've already possessed. Actually, it's pure potentiality. You can get trained. You can become competent, but your sort of raw material is what you are. Your brain and your muscles and your all that stuff, and that's all you have. So you basically sell your body in a sense, right? You sell your capacity to work, okay? So you own no means of production. Means of production mean things like land, mean things like machinery, mean things like if you have like a fund, like a grant where you could hire people, you have a wage fund, right? Monies. You have none of that stuff. All you have is your sheer capacity to work. And you put that in the marketplace and the capitalist buys it up. Who's the capitalist? Somebody that owns the means of production. So it's kind of like this complementary relationship. The proletariat wants to work. He has the capacity to work, but he has no means of production in order to work. He needs to find somebody that has the means of production, but doesn't really want to work themselves, as it were, okay? Or doesn't want to do the direct production. Okay, so they meet in the marketplace, and what Marx does is he draws a parallel between the peasant arrangement. Okay, Marx says that just like the peasants working for a subsistence wage and then continuing to work and the rest of it going to the Lord, the proletarians do something similar. They work for a subsistence wage. And look, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in England, if you were in London, Birmingham, Manchester, you name it, any of the new kind of burgeoning centers of industrial production back in the day, you were working for a wage that was barely enough to feed you and your family. So call it a survival wage, okay? The wage hardly ever rose above the mere minimum that was required, okay, to keep you fed and safe and so on, okay? So you have call it a subsistence wage, okay? And then what Marx says is, his interesting question was, what happens after the worker works enough so that he makes enough linen or shirts or candy bars, whatever it happens to be, whatever the products are, he works enough to sell the stuff that if it gets bought, it'll equal his wage or her wage. You hear me there? After the worker makes enough to pay off the wage, right? Basically, you're making money, and at some point, you're going to sell enough of that stuff so that you've actually equaled your wage. In a way, you've paid back the person who gave you the wage. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, Marx actually says that that's an important kind of point during the day to pay attention to that we're trained not to pay attention to. Okay? Because if you think about it, what you don't do is you don't stop working, go to the employer and say, well, we're even now. What do you want to do? Right? Usually what you do is you just keep on working because you've already contracted to work a certain average number of hours a day under certain conditions, you know, under conditions that your employer sets. And if you don't like it, well, then you can, you know, leave. You can not break the contract, but according to the contract, if you don't like these terms, okay, then you can find a way, you can terminate yourself or be terminated, right? Rarely, if ever, is there any kind of discussion wherein you say, well, look, I've just made enough value that it equaled my wage. Therefore, hey, if I continued working, I'm not sure I want to share anymore with you, my employer, right? That doesn't happen. But Marx said it's interesting to consider that it might. So what he does is he calls the work that you do after you've paid off your wage, he calls that surplus work, surplus labor, surplus value. Okay? He says that this is actually the source of profits. So you work over and above the amount of work you needed to pay off your wage, and that extra stuff, that surplus, is not owned by you, it's owned by the capitalist. And if you ask, why is it owned by the capitalist? Since you're the one that produced the work, produced the value, produced the stuff that gets paid for, there's actually a good answer for that. It's because you don't actually own your labor. Your labor was bought and paid for. You rented out your labor. You rented out your capacity to work, so it actually doesn't belong to you. That would be, you know, an answer that would be close to a legitimate answer, right? Because you've actually sold your capacity to work. So for the moment, it doesn't belong to you anymore. Okay, well, now, what more do I want to say here? Look, Marx, it is true, like many people of his day in the early 1800s, and by the way, biographical kind of background about Marx isn't anything that I entered in here. There is some stuff on that in the PowerPoint. But Marx was just one of a number of people who became relatively prominent scholars and intellectuals and political activists in the 1800s who called themselves either socialist or communist or so on. And what was somebody who was socialist or communist concerned about, worried about at the time? They were largely worried about gross inequalities economic inequalities, equalities in income and wealth and possessions and, conditions of life, largely between these people, right? Capitalists on the one hand and proletariats on the other. Okay, so inequalities of that sort. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out where I want to go from here. How much information I want to impart. I'm actually accustomed to a kind of longer period than we have in this 8-week setting. So I'm trying to make a decision on the spot of what more to go into. Let me just emphasize that once again, somebody like Marx is going to draw attention to inequalities. Okay, so from a conflict point of view, you do focus on inequalities, fragmentations, conflicts, and struggles between different categories of people. So he's going to focus on a conflict of interest between the capitalists and the proletariat, kind of pointing out that what's good for the one may not be good for the other. In fact, probably is systematically going to be not good for the other, right? The capitalists, it's actually in the interest of the capitalists to keep the wage as low as possible, but that's not in the interest of the proletariat. So there's going to be a struggle between these two groups. And in fact, socialists and people who call themselves socialists. By the way, let me just mention really quickly, this is on your PowerPoint. The first person who ever called himself a socialist was one of the most powerful and successful capitalists of his day. And it was a fellow named Robert Owen. And a kind of, I guess, I don't know if this is not ironic, but coincidental, Robert Owen actually spent a few years of his life living in southern Indiana, in the town of New Harmony, where he tried to set up a small kind of experimental community, which would be run according to principles of equality of production and compensation. You can check that out yourself if you would like to. So the New Harmony experiment. But this Robert Owen guy, what was he? He was actually an owner of a big old mill that pumped out like clothes and bedding and linen and so on up in Scotland. Very successful, immensely wealthy. But he also called himself a socialist. And what he meant by that is somebody who was concerned with what they called at the time the social question. And the social question were all of the questionable things that were happening in this new kind of economic system, which was based on factory labor, okay, between capitalists and the proletariats. So one of the problems were things like child labor, working conditions, the length of the day. You had, the proletariats working in the factory, they were working like 10, 12, 14, sometimes as long as close to 16 hours a day, right? Like the very limits of tolerability. Can you work more than 16 hours a day without dying, breaking down, right? So how hard can you run your workers before you wear out your workers, right? Well, an early struggle, industrial revolution between the working class, and the owning classes was the working day. People fought over the working day. They fought we need a 10-hour working day. We need a 9-hour working day. Finally, they sort of set their sights on the 8-hour working day, and now that's become kind of the standard in the industrial world. Okay? And you may argue, like, well, I don't see any 8-hour working day. I put in like 12-hour shifts, I put in 14-hour shifts, et cetera, et cetera. And Marx would say, well, the struggle is ongoing. It probably never ends. I mean, because history is the history of these kinds of struggles. And as long as there's still history, there's going to be these kinds of struggles. In any event, so I mentioned false consciousness, ideology, Okay, let me go on for about another 10 minutes and I'll stop, take a breath, and see if this stuff is being absorbed at all. Let me go back and say that, so ideology, a system of ideas, beliefs, and so on that support a system of exploitation, right? They support it supported the exploitation of the peasants by the lords. These ideas produce false consciousness. The ideology produces false consciousness. So the peasant thinks that, well, this is what I should expect. This is what I should get. This isn't unjust. This is the way the world was made by, God, or it's just the natural order of things. Okay. Now, in the capitalist system, Marx spends a fair amount of time talking about how certain ideas also work in the service of exploitation here. This is kind of a challenging to get these ideas across, so I think I don't know, if I have time, maybe I'll come back to them. But now let me take a quick stab at it. If it doesn't seem to make sense, you can let me know. But there are certain kinds of principles or ideas that became prominent beginning in, say, the 1700s and have become more or less the fabric of our society today. Ideas about equality and freedom, okay? That all people are born free, that's their natural state. Human beings prefer freedom to slavery, and actually that's the right state to be in. And equality, people with regard to certain things, like certain rights and obligations, they're also equal, or they should be, right? Especially when it comes to exercising choices, right? And you see this between the capitalist and the worker, right? The capitalist doesn't force the proletarian to work in the factory. They're both adults. They're both consenting adults who have, by the law, they are equal with each other. The capitalist isn't like the lord and the peasant, stands above the proletariat. They're both consenting adults, and when one decides to work for the other, they do it on equal footing. One decides voluntarily to sell their labor for a wage, and the other accepts that, right? And you call that a contract. The contract kind of seals the deal between consenting equal adults. And the proletariat is free to take that work, and he's free to say, the hell with it, I ain't working there anymore, right? So the idea is that the capitalists and the proletariat are equal with each other, and they're equally free to do as they choose, right? But Marx says, you know what, that's actually a distorted picture of the reality. What freedom does the proletariat really have? He's free to accept work in the factory, or what? He has a choice between accepting subsistence wages and then producing surplus for the capitalist, or he can probably starve, right? Maybe that's a choice, but Marx would say that's a sucky choice, right? That choice is lousy. The capitalist has other kinds of choices, right? He has a big bunch of money. He could decide to invest it here, decide to take a trip there. He could decide to hire this person. He could decide to pay higher wages. He has all kinds of different choices. That equality is an illusion, okay? They're not really on equal footing, right? And also that freedom, okay, is kind of an illusion too. So Marx would say that these ideas, these are kind of legal fictions. They're not legal realities, okay? And so ideology, to the extent that you can convince people that they're all on equal footing and they're all equally free, well, in a way, you're kind of you're pulling the wool over people's eyes, okay? You're creating false consciousness. Okay, so and in fact, Marx will say that, and let me go back now to on your homework. There was a couple words, infrastructure, and another word called superstructure. These should be totally reversed. So that is, one should be on the top, right? Super should be on the top. So let me go ahead and write that. Okay. Superstructure. And here's what the idea is. The idea is that Marx used this way of thinking to characterize any mode of production. So capitalism is a mode of production. Feudalism is a mode of production. Any mode of production, says Marx, can be characterized as having a bottom and a top, and the bottom, which he calls an infrastructure, it literally means the structure below, and a superstructure, the structure above. The infrastructure is kind of like the foundation. It's the hard, concrete core of the economic system, okay? The infrastructure is the economy. It's all the stuff we just talked about. It's producing, it's distributing, it's getting a wage, it's, you know, the work in the factories, it's buying the product, it's all that stuff that is undertaken between, you know, and it's the relationship between the capitalist and the proletarian, okay? And the superstructure, any mode of production, will also have its characteristic superstructure, says Marx. And a superstructure is all kinds of other stuff. And I think your book mentioned a whole bunch of what it called social institutions: family, church, schools, laws, the criminal justice system, beliefs, all this other stuff, a whole grab bag of other stuff. And what Marx said is that you can find, as the infrastructure changes, as we move from feudalism to capitalism to whatever may come after capitalism, as it changes, as the infrastructure changes, the superstructure will change as well. Okay, so it's a way of looking at or analyzing a given kind of social system. Here, a mode of production. Okay, so just to go back to some of the terms that you guys were asked to address in your homework. Okay, that's where this fits in. Tell you what, with that, let me now stop, take a breath, and take stock of where we are. Does anybody have any questions at this point about anything we've gone over? Any of the terms that I brought up, if they weren't clear? And let me unshare actually in just a second, and I'll wait if in the chat box or just verbally, if anybody wants to share their questions. Anybody got anything for me? Anything about Marx? Okay. Again, let me compare him with, or contrast him with, the guy we talked about last time. So Durkheim, right? So Durkheim, in talking about division of labor, collective consciousness, glue that holds society together, right? He envisioned, you know, society kind of cohering and things holding together and staying the same. Okay, the story we just told, okay, recounting Marx's view of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, the focus really was on, right, conflicts and conflicts of interest between different groups. Okay, what's good for one group may not be good for another, indeed may actually be bad for another group. Okay, what are the roles of ideas? For Durkheim, the roles of ideas, again, they were part of the collective consciousness, so they were really for holding society together, okay, gluing different groups together. For Marx, ideas very often can have a more sinister purpose, right? They can hide or conceal and help perpetuate the wrong or the harms or the injustices that are taking place in society, right? They can pull the wool over your eyes. That's kind of his view. Now, I would say, just as an aside, we don't actually have to choose between those two ways of looking at the world and looking at ideas. Probably both, you can find truth in both, I would suspect, right? Ideas really can serve to unify human beings across divisions. But no question about it, ideas can also serve to make us minimize or overlook or fail to see harms that are being done to others, harms that are even being done to ourselves. I mean, that's my own suspicion about things. I can see them serving both these kinds of functions.